And we've done this community over the years. Actually, we've had events for the general public, and tonight is all about Initiate, really, this great program that we have. And it's also the TCD COVID-19 Immunology Project, and those two sort of, I guess, groups of people have come together to bring tonight to you. And there's various things on the program, it must be said. It's kind of broken into 3 different sections. This first section is going to be a sort of a question and answer thing between students that are part of Initiate and then principal investigators. There's going to be 4 separate discussions, which we're very happy to do, of course. And the title is, as you can see it there, what to say to the vaccine hesitant is the topic that we're going to have. And then people can send in questions under the comments, and we will read out the questions and try and answer them as we go along. And whatever you want to ask, we'll do our best to try and answer them. And this first part then, the reason why I'm opening it is because I'm first to go in the interview. And Hauke is going to ask me some questions. Aren't you, Hauke?
Yes, we will. So let's start. I'm very happy to see you here, Luke. Great that you could join us. So about vaccine hesitancy, of course, over the past few months, we in Ireland have been quite fortunate in having like a huge uptake of the COVID vaccine, which we're very fortunate for. But maybe can you tell us about times that you've maybe had run-ins with people who are hesitant to vaccinate, and what do you usually talk to them?
Yeah, sure. But I mean, there was hesitancy from the start in many ways, and people had concerns, didn't they? And they're understandable, these concerns, by the way. So I would have a lot of emails off people, actually. And I'm talking at the peak of it. We're talking April, May, June, like 50 emails a day were coming into me from people with questions and concerns. And I answered every one. I tried to anyway. There'd be one liner. I couldn't spend all day answering, but I try and answer them as best I could. And it was understandable. I mean, there were questions like, the questions that came up were like, these vaccines were made very fast. And I could counter that by saying, well, yes, they were made fast, but that's only because there was resources put into it, and reassure people about that one. A lot of questions about pregnant women, would the vaccine harm them? There was no evidence for that. We could reassure them on that one. I'd often send them actually links to good websites. For pregnant women, I mean, when wanting to get pregnant, there's a great document by the Royal College of Obstetricians in the UK, for example, and the HSE in Ireland had a great website. Yeah. In other words, there were understandable concerns. And then I always thought our job was to give our view and say, look, here's the science that reassures you that you should take these vaccines. The benefits far outweigh the risks, was always the argument. And that wasn't based on opinion. That's what the evidence said, because clearly the European Medicines Agency in Brussels, and then they're in Rotterdam, they're in Holland now, I think they used to be in London. And then there was the HSE, the MHRA in Ireland. There was, all those bodies said, look, the benefits far outweigh the risks, and I said trust these people who have those opinions. So although the hesitancy was evident, it wasn't that difficult to come up with arguments to reassure people. And to me, it was all about reassurance and trying to reassure people of the safety and efficacy of these vaccines.
Great. So you would definitely say that you at first have to acknowledge the fears that the people maybe have, and then take it from there and then counter them with proper scientific evidence.
That's right. But people don't, through the whole pandemic, people are more anxious than they would ever have been in their lives, maybe, So you're putting into this a background level of anxiety and worry about everything, not just about vaccines. The whole pandemic was worry, and that then would feed anxieties and questions and concerns. And it's very human, isn't it? We were all, even I got scared sometimes, Remember back in January, we had a really rough time in Ireland, for instance. So again, all you could do is acknowledge that people are right to be worried and fearful. Something so new as COVID, it's a brand new virus, new vaccines. These are all understandable fears. Many didn't have them, and many took the vaccine and were quite happy to trust the advice being given by public health experts. But a fair percentage did want a bit more reassurance, and that's really what it was all about.
Yeah, definitely. Look, what would you think? How many people could you convince of those that asked you questions or that first approached you being hesitant, just overall, including ones that may be a bit more aggressive versus those that are just coming with questions?
Well, there were 2 camps. The anti-vaxxers, I wouldn't talk to them, actually. So you'd never convince them in a million years. So I would waste my time addressing them. So I never addressed what you might call the anti-vax campaign. They can have their opinion, of course they can, but you're never going to convince them. The ones I would address are the ones you might call hesitant, and they were the ones I would be talking to most of all. And look at the numbers, Hauke. I believe in County Waterford, 99% of the adult population is fully vaccinated.
That's true, yeah.
And apparently there's nowhere in the world has reached 99%. And Waterford deserves a shout out. God bless the people in Waterford. And in Ireland, we're very proud of ourselves. We love boasting when we're successful, the Irish, as our partners in Initiate Now. 92% of the over 18s are fully vaccinated right now in Ireland, which is a tremendous achievement, isn't it? And it's fantastic.
It is great.
Other countries in Europe, like the Scandinavian countries, are great. I've just come back from Germany, as you know. How good that's about 60, 65 apparently, not quite as good. Eastern Europe is struggling. In fact, there was somebody from Slovenia at the conference, and they were saying, look, they were trying to advise people, and I think they've got to about 30% vaccination there. So it's very mixed all over Europe, isn't it? And there's all kinds of reasons for that, by the way. But in Ireland, I think that the good news for all of us, having spent all the effort trying to reassure people, that the uptake has been very strong, hasn't it? So we're very. I mean, I think the Irish people deserve credit for taking the advice, looking into it themselves, discussing it, all that kind of thing. So I think it's a great result really for Ireland.
Yeah, it has definitely been very present here. And I just saw a statistic this morning. The county with the highest cases is definitely the one with the lowest vaccine uptake in Ireland, at the very least.
Yeah. Well, again, you can't argue with the data. How come? Look at America. If you want evidence that vaccines work, right, look at Florida, look at Houston, look at Israel. There's endless replication of this experiment, which says vaccines are very, very effective against this virus. They stop you getting sick. They stop you ending up in hospital. If you're unvaccinated, you're at high risk of severe disease and death. That's the bottom line, right? And no one can counter that science now. The science is absolutely copper bottomed, you see. And of course, at the start, we weren't sure of this. They were new vaccines. They were, experimental to some extent. They were tested for safety, of course, with the trials. But now we know that in the real world, we've hardly ever seen vaccines perform so well against a serious infectious disease as these vaccines have. And there's no arguing with that, in my view, anyway.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. Lastly, maybe a very broad question. Has this pandemic shaped your approach to how you reach out to people over broad science aspects and science communication in general?
Yep, I'm never doing it again. No, I'm only kidding. Well, it's been very intense. I was doing science communication long before COVID, as you know, like I was on the radio a bit and doing stuff. We're talking science communication on steroids, to use a famous phrase, remember? Because it was relentless. Every day they were on to me, and Clean is the same, and various people, and we just stepped up and did it. It was just a very intense time, and it wasn't difficult because we had the information. So why wouldn't we share our knowledge? We are immunologists after all, and we want to share what we know. Of course, if you're an academic, you want to share with students or whoever. The public are part of that dialogue, really. I think I probably it was very important to be accurate. You had to make sure that you'd done your homework kind of thing, and what you were talking about was backed up by good evidence. The big difference, how could that happen, was though we were often talking about stuff that wasn't published yet, and that was unusual. And I was always a bit uneasy doing that. I wouldn't before COVID. My science stuff in the media was stuff that had been published and had been peer reviewed. COVID was different. It was stuff coming out every day, and then you had to keep talking about it. You couldn't not. It was such an important topic, and it was so serious. You had to talk about stuff that wasn't published, and you mightn't have seen the data, and that was a bit uneasy for scientists, myself included, but then again, it was special circumstances. What will happen now is we'll go back to the way it was. We should only talk about stuff that's peer-reviewed and published because the emergency's passed, and therefore go back to not the correct way, but certainly the more robust way to do this is to talk about published work that's been peer-reviewed and is very reliable. I would say though we didn't get much wrong. I mean, even though the stuff was released before standard publication, there aren't too many examples of where stuff was wrong, actually, really, so that's good. So in other words, I don't think we did anything wrong by talking about stuff that wasn't published, in a sense. So that was okay.
Yeah, no, definitely. All right, great. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, there's a few comments. Will we do those? How next? What do you think?
Sorry?
There's a few comments have come in. Will we do those?
Yeah, sure. If you find one that interests you.
Yeah, there's one there, actually. Stephanie Longier, it looks like. How do you explain sometimes people are more worried about the vaccine than the virus itself, even if the evidence shows that the vaccine is efficient? That's a really good question, Stephanie. And all you can say there is, look, the vaccine is the spike protein. That's all, remember, The virus has 29 proteins. So which would you rather have in your body? 29 alien proteins or one, And then we know the spike will drive a great immune response, and it's only in your body for a very short time. It's not the intact virus. So those are the kinds of arguments. I mean, one example recently would be the risk of autoimmunity, for example. And of course, there's a risk of if you're an immunologist, that maybe the spike has a similar protein in humans, and maybe you're going to react to your own protein. The virus is 29 proteins, much higher risk of autoimmunity from the virus than the vaccine, for instance. So it's those kinds of arguments you make to say that the vaccine is far preferable to the actual infectious agent itself, which has all kinds of nastiness in it. The beauty of vaccines, as we all know, is they're weakened forms of the pathogen or pieces of the pathogen, and they're safe for that reason. You know, so you use those are the kind of arguments I guess you would use. Another one there, Christopher Gallagher. So if the vaccine doesn't stop transmission, how do the benefits outweigh the risks for children getting vaccinated? Well, they do stop transmission, first of all, because it's not true. So if you look at someone who's vaccinated, they'll probably carry half the amount of virus in their noses than someone who isn't vaccinated. There's some evidence for that. Delta did change that a bit. Delta does seem much more transmissible, you know. So in other words, if the vaccines aren't that good at stopping transmission, you still justify vaccine use by protecting vulnerable people from getting sick, you see. So that's the key argument. Now, the children one's a good question, because if the adult population is vaccinated, there's reasonable evidence that the children get less infected, because that's the way it is, you know, and that's good as well. So it's a tricky one, that issue about transmission, really. But overall, we definitely are of the view that the vaccines will get rid of the virus eventually, because there will be a slight effect on transmission, is the hope, I guess, is the way you put it. There's one more here. Is there? What we see now? Gloria Miller. She's got a few FDA-approved drugs were recalled in 2020. I don't know the answer to that, Gloria, to be honest. Remember, every drug has a safety concern, and sometimes drugs do get withdrawn because they're shown in the wild, like in the real world, then to have issues. So sometimes that happens. Would be one answer there. I don't know the number. It's a very rigorous process, remember. I mean, in my experience, and I know people in the FDA and the EMA, these are the most careful people. They have everybody's best interest at heart. They examine the data zealously. You know, if they approve a new medicine or a vaccine, they're confident that it should be safe. Now, when you go into 500,000 people or 1 million people, you might reveal rare effects, you know, and then they respond. The great thing about this as well, by the way, is the monitoring is tremendous, you know, because obviously it's called phase 4 sometimes for this. And they're watching all the time for adverse events. And it does sometimes happen. They decide, oh, this new drug that we approved, we want to change the label maybe on it, whatever it might be. So it's all about a very rigorous process. People forget how rigorous the FDA and the EMA are. Now, shall we move on to the next one? How we do?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Hauke. Now, the next two people are Magda and John, I believe. So over to you, Magda.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And so let's start. So, John, I would like to start from with a very broad question. So, what would you say to a vaccine-hesitant individual? I think we can't hear you, John. Maybe you should unmute. I'm not sure.
That's a good idea.
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, good. Well, welcome to everybody joining the European Researchers Night. I just want to say one thing before getting started, and that is that the Initiate program that we are all part of actually it aims to recruit, has recruited 15 PhD students throughout Europe. And this program just got started in January of 2020 with a big kickoff, and it really was a historic moment in a sense, because this was really when the pandemic was just getting started, realized that it was a serious pandemic in China, and soon after that it made the jump to Italy and beyond. I think these students are getting an extremely unique education, not just research in the lab, but also learning about the reality of a global pandemic, unlike anything that's been seen for the last century. From that pandemic, and it hit everybody very, very rapidly and took everyone by surprise, scared a lot of people, scared me, scared probably just about anybody. And it has led to a variety of thoughts and opinions about the vaccination. I've encountered a few vaccine hesitant people. I won't say that they were anti-vaxxers. I would say that they were vaccine hesitant. And what I tried to do with this was, and I think this needs to be stated over and over again, is that the development of multiple vaccines within the space of a year that are highly effective as any vaccines that we've seen, is almost miraculous. It didn't happen overnight. Obviously, a large number of resources were put to this program, as Luke alluded to, but at the same time, pharmaceutical companies and university academic units and so on are always researching ways to develop better vaccines. And when this pandemic hit, I think there was a real readiness that was there to move forward rapidly with the development of new vaccines. So I think that's a point that needs to be noted. And I think that with time, this may well be recognized as one of the most important medical advances in history, frankly. The vaccine hesitant people, yes, you can understand that there are multiple reasons for this. Not everyone is familiar with the immune system, viruses, infectious disease, and all of a sudden these vaccines come out of nowhere. What I've tried to explain as well to the vaccine hesitant is that this idea of a new vaccine strategy, the mRNA vaccine strategy, has been around for some time, has been tested before, was being actually used as a strategy for cancer vaccines before it was adapted by Pfizer-BioNTech for the infectious disease. And it is an extremely effective vaccine that has emerged, and one that actually gives very high levels of protection. So I think that is one of the most important things to point out. It is, and it's something that deserves to be stated over and over again, because as this pandemic evolves and as the virus evolves, there are always new twists and turns that seem to be coming up. And so I think that it's important that we understand that these vaccines were made quickly, but they were made with a great deal of care. As Luke alluded to, the vaccine producers, companies are amongst the most reluctant and careful researchers anywhere in terms of making sure that their products are effective and safe. So I think I think these are all kind of factors that work together to increase, I think, that should increase the confidence in these vaccines, not to mention the fact that the evidence, the real world evidence is out there of the efficiency of these vaccines. Well, I'll stop there.
Yeah. So also it was mentioned before, but I would also like your comments. Does SARS-CoV-2 natural infection offers better immunity than vaccination?
I think there is evidence now that argues that natural immunity to SARS is better than the acquired immunity generated by vaccination. You can imagine there's a very simple reason for that. In fact, the virus initially is contacted through the lungs, and it is recognized by cells of the individual and the immune system as being a foreign antigen. So a natural immunity evolves. In the case of vaccination, on the other hand, you're taking a small piece of the virus, a critical piece of the virus, the spike protein, which is involved in interaction with cells, and you're injecting it into a muscle cell, in your arm. So the routes of administration are different. On the other hand, the immunity that evolves is nonetheless effective at preventing disease in the lungs and eliminating virus from the lungs. So natural immunity, of course, is preferable to acquired immunity through vaccination. On the other hand, I would not want to take the 1 or 2 chances out of 100 that I catch COVID and it's going to kill me, because that's kind of where the numbers are. So I think that all of this sort of argues in favor of boosting our immunity through vaccination.
Do you think that there's a possibility of a COVID-19 variant that outsmarts the vaccines that are developed at the moment?
I think it probably is a possibility. Certainly the Delta variant, while it hasn't overcome the vaccination efficacy, there is a decrease in the level of immunity that is generated against Delta variants. That possibility that a variant will arise that is resistant to or evades the vaccination strategies that we have in place is a possibility. That possibility decreases as people become vaccinated. You no longer have a large population host that can allow virus to replicate and change and mutate so that it becomes a different variant. So again, this argues not only in terms of the personal protective effect of the vaccine, but sort of the protective effect of vaccination for the entire population.
Nice. I would like to ask also something else. Are you concerned by the level of the anti-vaccine commentary in the media and online?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. And I don't think that we've seen anything like this before. It is, of course, confusing when the messages are so mixed. And I think you know this, Magda, from this line that I've said from a comedian who said, you know, who would have thought that having all of the knowledge of the universe at your fingertips would lead to more stupid people? And unfortunately, it sometimes seems that people are grabbing onto misinformation and running with that rather than trusting the experts on this. And I think that is an issue that has to be dealt with. And I think it probably has to be dealt with in a long-term, perhaps campaign or education network that would allow people to hear from local people, from doctors, from infectious disease experts about just what this vaccine is, what this virus is, what the whole pandemic is. And I think that a lot of countries have not yet done that, have not grappled with that, to try to, if you will, provide a infomercial or an education program that would really educate not just individuals, but entire populations in countries.
Nice. And as a final question, I would like to ask you, what do you think is the future of this pandemic?
Well, I think the pandemic is alive and well, sad to say. I think the future of this pandemic, first of all, the virus is here. It's not going to go away. The reality is we need to learn to live with it. And the way that we're going to be able to live with it is to continue to develop vaccine programs that vaccinate the world. At this stage, the pandemic is going in a number of different directions. In Europe and in Canada and in some other countries, the vaccination rates are up around 70–75%. And those countries are beginning to open up again in terms of their, getting back to normal and people being able to interact. In America, as it was alluded to before, there's a significant minority of the population that is vaccine hesitant or anti-vaxxers. And they really are resistant for a number of reasons to getting a vaccine. And now the situation in America is again critical because the Delta variant has infected younger people, unvaccinated people, and putting them into the hospital where, 99% of the people ending up in hospital are unvaccinated. The pandemic is also, I hate to say it, alive and well in continents like Africa and South America, in parts of India and Russia. Some of these areas we don't hear very much about, but they also are lagging behind in terms of vaccination rates. So that is, again, sort of a third group where there's real concern, and I think we have to get those people. We have to take the global imperative here and move forward with vaccination for the whole world. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe.
That is so true. Thank you very much for the interview.
Okay. Magda, do you want to look at some comments and see what?
Yes,
Ask?
there are many comments. What is your opinion on the US being 37th on the global vaccination list behind Mongolia?
You would be the third global person behind Mongolia. Yeah, well, I think that this is reflecting the divergent opinions in the United States, and without getting political about it, you do. I think we all realize there were political forces that were kind of pushing against not just the severity of the pandemic, but also questioning the efficacy of the vaccination. I didn't know that the United States was behind Mongolia in terms of vaccination efficiencies, but we'll take that under advisement. Clearly though, in the United States, in a country that wants to lead the vaccine sort of charge globally, I think we have to deal with the issue of getting those people who are resistant to vaccination. We have to get them on board and get them vaccinated. It's not easy. It's going to take time, and hopefully people will respond to the message that's out there. People who are not vaccinated are dying and ending up in hospital. And I think that obviously needs to change, not just on a US scale, but on a global scale.
That is very true. Thank you very much. I don't know if you would like to answer to more comments from the comment session.
Oh my God. Well, I see one here about mRNA vaccines causing long-term side effects such as organ failure and death. And I don't think there is anything to substantiate that. As Luke mentioned earlier, you're only taking a small piece of that virus. The spike protein is responsible for interaction with cells in the lungs, and you're making a vaccine that reacts against that. And I think that there is no evidence at this point that it's resulting in long-term organ failures or complications. What is causing organ failures, complications, including multi-organ inflammatory syndrome in children, is the virus infection. This is a very cunning virus. It has learned ways, it has evolved ways to get out of the lungs, so it's not just a respiratory disease, but can affect many other organs in the body. That's where the danger lies, not with an mRNA vaccine.
Very good. Thank you, John. I think we're going to move on to the next interview, if you don't mind. And thanks to the pair of you. That was very interesting. So our next interview is going to be between Marie-Elaine and Sophia. Over to you guys.
Hello.
Hello, Marie-Elaine.
Hi.
I first wanted to ask you, because I've seen that so I just want to introduce Marie-Elaine a little bit to the public. So she's a Dutch virologist from Leiden, and she has been working on coronaviruses even before the pandemic. So I think your world has completely changed ever since this pandemic hit in. So can you tell us a little bit about how this changed your science, your work, and your job in general?
Yeah, that's definitely true. There, a lot of things changed for me and for my colleagues here, also in Leiden, and also for, I think, for any coronavirologist in the world. I mean, we have been working in an academic hospital, and I have been working on coronaviruses since 2006, and my group leader, Eric Snyder, for example, way longer even. But we almost always had to defend ourselves when saying that we were working on these viruses, because we never had patients to do work on. So we were, criticized for not having enough contact with our clinical departments. And so what's the use of investigating this? And of course, we always had the argument, okay, so well, these viruses are actually very interesting and they are potentially very dangerous, because we know from all the work that has been done on coronaviruses before this pandemic that these kind of viruses are quite prone to zoonosis, so to jump from animals where a lot of coronaviruses are there. That was already known as well. And these relatively easily can jump to humans. And of course, that is the general opinion on how this pandemic, of course, appeared as well. But that knowledge already indicated that this is something to really take into account and try and understand as well as possible, so that we would be prepared better for something that just happened. And so as scientists and coronavirologists, we're always emphasizing this. But yeah, it's like, nobody was, well, it was quite difficult to get funding, etc. And this situation, of course, changed now. And I'm reluctant to say that this is indeed, there's this saying in Dutch saying, when the calf drowned, then finally something is going to happen. And so now the calf has drowned. And this is only when a lot of new money, of course, comes in to be sure that we will be better prepared for the next pandemic. Not only necessarily a new coronavirus, but there's more viruses out there that have similar chances of causing outbreaks like that. So that situation changed tremendously. And for us, of course, in a way that is good. I mean, it's been like a roller coaster, and it's been like a global something with an impact that is just unbelievable. But I think on the positive side, now global population is convinced that this is a serious subject that we and also scientists should really take effort to spend energy on, because this is seriously threatening human society.
I am sure nobody is now questioning why are you working on coronavirus.
Yeah, no, nobody. I did not have to defend myself in the past year, so that's a real big difference indeed. And yeah, it changed a lot, of course, for us. We our group expanded a lot, and we have never been more busy than this past year. Not only on research, but also indeed on dissemination and talking to media, and trying to use our expertise to inform people. And I think I personally see this as a very important role that we have as coronavirologists and virologists in general, to inform people how things are really working, and including how vaccines work and how efficient those are and how well they work. Because yeah, that's apparently, and that's obviously, and when I look at all these comments, there's a lot of people still that have doubts about that. And yeah, that's a serious thing. Even when everyone can see now that indeed the vaccines that have been used in the past year have really turned around things now. I mean, in those countries where those vaccine percentages are high enough, the situation is changing drastically, and this is definitely due to these vaccines, and this is so obvious. But still, yeah, there's a lot of debate still. Yeah.
Indeed, I am aware that you have also become in the spotlight ever since the pandemic hit in. Also, a lot of TV interviews and journal articles. How do you approach sensitive topics when you're talking in public? Because there are quite some topics that even scientists don't have a consensus on, and are still debated. And it's just, I feel also responsible whenever I talk to someone to talk about these topics, such as origins of SARS-CoV-2 and
that's indeed, well, I personally think that it's very important to be honest. I mean, in some cases, indeed, even the scientists don't know and have different opinions sometimes, which of course is very confusing to people, because there's so many questions and there's so many opinions and there's so much out there that it's, for anyone, it's very difficult to, you know, form your own opinion with the information that you get from all sides. So yeah, that's very difficult to do. So yeah, I lost your question.
I also find it hard in my own life, and I'm not in the spotlight, so I'm
and
really
indeed, yeah, it's important to, if there's doubts also in scientific world, that just to be honest about that, because we don't know everything. I mean, humankind can do so many things, but we don't control everything. We don't know everything, and that is something that we have to deal with, and we have to, you know, find the solutions together and using science, because this is well, a very strong way of getting the right answers. So yeah, I always try and emphasize that.
One thing I'm very interested in is, what do you think is influencing? So I really hope that virologists and scientists who are in the spotlight now are influencing people's opinions, but I'm wondering what influences people's opinions most, or do you think you can have a bigger impact than politicians, for example, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you never know. It is also, I think, very personal. My own personal experience is that the best way is to have a one-to-one conversation about things, because very often people have very specific questions, and if you are able to answer those specific questions in a logical way, and they can see, yeah, this sounds logical and I can believe what you're saying, then they are easily convinced. Because I noticed that people that hesitate on taking a vaccine usually just lack information to be able to form that opinion. And if I can provide that information in a logical way and explain how things are working, then in most cases people are not easy, or are easy to convince, actually, because when people start understanding really what is going on, then they can understand why vaccines work and how they work, and that it is it's a brilliant way of dealing with virus diseases. And I always also emphasize that this is so obvious from the history. I mean, things like smallpox, a very, very serious disease, much more serious than this SARS coronavirus 2, actually, because so many millions of people died from that. And in that case, particularly also children were hit very hard, and lethality rates were 35% for that virus. So this is, you know, COVID is like not even 5%, and this is 35 people who got infected with that virus. Anyway, a big virus. A lot of people don't even know this virus. It got eradicated because of a vaccine that just worked. So this is one of the examples that I often give, because it's so obvious that vaccines are a good idea.
Yeah, sometimes I also feel that the more dangerous a virus is, the easier is to convince people to actually take action.
Yeah, well, and that is also because in one of the other discussions, it was, why are people more afraid of vaccines than of viruses? And my opinion, or my idea about that, is that we don't have to deal with a lot of viruses anymore. Viral diseases are not very common anymore. But that is because we have all these vaccine programs. So we're now only dealing with the vaccines instead of the diseases. But nobody realizes how much worse and how gross these diseases have been in history until vaccines became available. And so, and of course, now you would say, okay, COVID is all around and people still die from COVID. So that disease and that virus is very much in the picture still. But apparently, for most people, this is not the case, in the sense that they are still more afraid of the vaccine than of the virus itself. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. But I think the part of that explanation is that we are so used to being protected from virus and other infectious diseases because of all these vaccine programs, that we don't know about them anymore. We don't see children who are, you know, paralyzed by polio, for example. We don't see smallpox cases of small children that really die of this disease. And that is why, yeah, probably the vaccines are more under debate than the diseases.
Indeed. Now that you mentioned smallpox, actually, what I find really wonderful about that is that this disease got eradicated somehow with an international collaboration and like a huge effort from every part of the world. Mm-hmm. How do you see this, if this could happen to COVID, or if this is happening already? Or
well, yeah, the starting question there is, would it be possible to really eradicate SARS coronavirus 2 or any other viruses? I think smallpox, yeah, because smallpox, I think, was an example of something that was apparently possible to eradicate. But of course, there's many viral diseases that will be almost impossible to eradicate. For example, for coronaviruses, we know that there's a very big reservoir of viruses in animals. And so as soon as you eradicate SARS-2, there will be other coronaviruses waiting out there in animals to jump back into people. So really getting rid of that group of viruses will probably be very difficult. And the same counts for example, viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes, because there will always be reservoirs in mosquitoes and also in other animals of those viruses, which make it very difficult to eradicate that disease completely. And even for polio, which is on the brink of being eradicated, there's theories that when that is eradicated, there are still viruses out there that look like polio and could, you know, evolve into viruses that very much look like polio again. So as soon as virus is eradicated because everyone's vaccinated, for example, you can never stop worrying, because if you stop vaccinating, then you have a generation of people that is not vaccinated. And when something like this happens, so a new virus jumps from animals or evolves somehow to be another virus, then yeah, you have a new virus. We virologists always say we will never be out of work. I mean, and that is a good thing for us, of course, but the bottom line is that we as humanity have to deal and have to live with viruses, because they have been with us throughout evolution of humanity, and we will never get rid of them. And in a way we could, I mean, and of course, what people often think that viruses are all bad, they make you sick, but that's not all true. I mean, the interesting part is that in some cases, we also live with our viruses, and it's almost a symbiosis. I mean, each of us sitting here, we have at least 2, 3, 4 herpes viruses, and we never get symptoms from that. They're in us, and there's theory and scientific research that shows that their presence actually helps our immune system to be alert. And so in that way, you could look at, you know, the interaction of humans and their viruses as something that is a natural situation. It's just that some of these viruses sometimes, you know, cause disease and kill people. But then
I find this topic very interesting, because nowadays we pay a lot of attention, and we hear a lot about the bacteria that are commensals, that we live together with, and are symbionts in
and are symbiotic and are so important for us. And also there, it's even more obvious that we are living with bacteria and that they are essential to our own viability. I mean, without them, we cannot even live.
Indeed. So and we still don't hear about the symbiotic viruses, because it's just so little.
But they are there. Yeah, I'm sure.
You also mentioned, as a last question, because I think we are a bit over time, you mentioned that we are never going to be out of job, which is the good and bad news, obviously, in the same time.
Yeah.
How could we anticipate the appearance of other zoonotic viruses? What could be a worldwide approach to be more prepared than we have been in this pandemic?
Yeah, of course, there's a lot of thought on that subject right now after a pandemic like this. So this we don't want to experience again, if possible. And I think the answer has several different pillars. One of them being, for example, monitoring, so surveillance, and being aware of viral sequences in animals that are known to carry a lot of them. Well, one example being bats, for example. This is an animal that has a special twist to its immune system that apparently causes them to carry a relatively high amount or high number of different viruses. And so these kind of animals are prone to provide new viruses to other animal populations, and then also humans, of course. So surveillance is one thing. So if we are aware of what's going on, and then of course research that will characterize how these viruses work, how they jump, how they cause disease, will also cause possibilities to develop antiviral agents and vaccines. And then we have to make sure that we have things on the shelf. So vaccine platforms, as have been used now in this pandemic. So the adenovirus platform that is used by Janssen and AstraZeneca, and of course now the mRNA platform that you could look at as a platform as well, that has been evolved enormously fast in this pandemic, and is now, well, obviously a very good platform as well. So things like that, which will do a lot of pre-work, so that once a new virus comes in, we know exactly what to do. And so we can develop vaccines very quickly. But the best way, of course, was not to respond to a new pandemic, but to be sure that they cannot happen anymore. So, and then that surveillance, I think, is a very important part. So to be sure what's going on. And as soon as we see sequences and virus variants that jump or could infect people, for example, we could act in a very early stage. But of course, that's also probably very difficult. I mean, you can never monitor the whole world and the whole animal population, and anything could happen. So in the end, we still have to deal with it. And then you have to make sure that you are prepared by scientific research and pre-development of vaccines and antivirals.
Thanks a lot. Also, great new information for me. And
yeah, you're welcome.
Great. We better move on to our last interview. Thanks very much there to Marjolaine and Sophia. So the last one is going to be Cliona and Mihai. A few more questions have come in that we might take as well, Cliona, if you like. But why don't you get going on the interview anyway, and then we might come back to some of those comments.
Yeah, Cliona, I think.
Oh, I'm mute, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Cliona Farley, Professor of Comparative Immunology in TBSI, and part of this Initiate ITN program. And this is Hauke and Mihai Solaria, who is one of the 13 PhD students across Europe. So Mihai, have you known somebody who has been vaccine hesitant?
Yeah, I know someone.
Yeah.
I know someone. Some of my relatives, they had this issue, trying to convince them, but sometimes it's hard. And I think one of the when you look at there are different people and different kind of hesitancies. So there are people who don't know what to do, so they would ask the people that they think they're more informed and they would trust you. For instance, a professor in immunology or a PhD student that is studying that. But there are also other people that are more hesitant, and they actually are misinformed. So in that case, it's a harder work in order to convince them, because they show.
Have you had a specific example that you can tell us?
Yeah, I have some. My aunt and my uncle.
Yeah.
So they got COVID last year.
Right.
Fortunately, they didn't. It wasn't severe.
Okay.
They recovered. They fully recovered. But in the last summer, they were hesitant about the vaccination. In the end, they got the vaccine. They live in Italy. In the end, they got the vaccine, but it wasn't because of they were convinced.
But did they talk to you? Did they ask? Did they ask you?
Yes, they asked me. But still, they were really, really trapped in this sort of misinformation that was convincing them to not go. in that direction, which is, I think it's fair from one point, and I think it's also scientists' role to inform the population, and that's also what we are trying to do tonight.
Yeah. But interestingly, like you said, that they got COVID, but it wasn't that serious. And I think this is a real problem. And we can see it in the comments here. Somebody said, why should children get vaccinated? Because they only get mild disease. And someone else commented on the term mild disease. I read a really fascinating article today about this word mild, that it is used by clinicians to mean a disease that doesn't put you in hospital. But for many of us, that's getting sick is actually quite serious, and the mild doesn't really describe what happens to lots of people. And so this is a big issue with children getting COVID. Sure, many of them may be asymptomatic, but many can get really seriously ill. And that's what the vaccine protects against.
With the vaccination are protecting also other people. So
exactly.
If you think about the child that he's not, it's not gonna get in a drastic situation, but you don't know the grandma or the granddad. You don't know if they are going to infect them, how the situation will actually turn.
Yeah, exactly. But I was really intrigued that your words to your aunt and uncle did not persuade them. I mean, I had a very, very you say people believe professors of immunology. Not always. In fact, some people really dislike an expert telling them what to do, and not that that's how they treat it, but I've got really fabulous next door neighbors, and they contacted me about one of their number, who's this lovely neighbor. She's a young woman who is pregnant and with her second child, and her husband and her father-in-law contacted me because they were really worried because she wouldn't take the vaccine. And so what was I going to say or do? And I really felt that being the professor of immunology was not the approach. So, because I really, really do understand pregnant people. I've been pregnant several times myself, and you're scared about doing anything that might harm the baby. And even if this is where your point about the false information is such an important one. If a person hears even the vague rumor that something will go wrong, well, then that's the bit they hear. They hear the bad bit. And so this is where data is actually really useful. And when a paper has been published, say from Israel, where tens of thousands of pregnant women have received the vaccine with no difficulty, well, then you can actually quote numbers. Anyway, I would tell Stewie, her husband, I'd text him little tidbits of information that I thought might persuade Gemma to take the vaccine. And of course, I was just so delighted with myself when I heard she got the vaccine. I said, all my efforts of tiptoeing around here have been successful. But I went across on Sunday to ask her what actually made her change her mind. And what she said was that it was real. She went to someone's house where they had got COVID, but they didn't tell her. And she suddenly realized she wasn't going to be able to protect herself or the little fetus herself from the virus. And so therefore she needed the vaccine. Now, maybe that's what actually made her do it, but hopefully the little bits of information helped. But it is a big issue. It's a big issue, I think. And what your point about people being hesitant for different reasons, I think we really have to acknowledge that.
Exactly. And it's important also the source of the information. This is something that is really important. And I was also reading through the comments, and there were people like citing some psychologists. Like if you go and check the person that is actually saying that is quoting that, and you check the source.
Yes.
Is it a real source? Is it believable?
Yes.
We don't know.
Yes. Because actually, you're making another good point, and one I was screaming at the screen to get at Luke. I completely disagree with Luke that we've never encountered this before, people believing misinformation. Humans have been creating and believing misinformation since we could talk. So I think it's just we're aware of it. You know, I mean, that's how myths and fairy stories and all of these voodoo thoughts and all the banshees, everything in this country, we've got loads and loads of stuff that people believed in that was, well, mostly nonsense. But I think, and I think it's very important to acknowledge the human tendency to believe certain things that mightn't necessarily seem rational to others.
Yeah, no, that's true. There are some comments here.
Yes. Oh, read out Stephanie's one there.
I can show her.
Yeah.
So based on what Kina was saying, some people dislike listening to experts because some people think we have some interest to say get vaccinated, but it's just based on evidence.
Yes, but of course we know that as scientists. We convinced, you know, I'm not getting any personal gain from the whole country getting vaccinated, from all of Waterford, but nevertheless that can be a perception that we must be getting something out of it. Whereas what Stephanie says is absolutely right. We just see the evidence. We know lives are being saved. We know people are being kept out of the hospital by vaccines. Now, we also know that vaccines aren't perfect. And not everybody responds in the same way to a vaccine. Not everybody is protected. And then there are some variants that can break through. And so this comes then adds to the kind of the slight murkiness of the message, as John Hiscott said. But overall, we just keep seeing the data. And so that's what has us convinced. But yeah, because some people just that we have some interest, but no, you're right, Stephanie. It's based on okay. Oh, the LB one. Read that one out, Mihai.
Yes. Yeah. So, how has the pandemic transformed your perspective on vaccine hesitancy, and how we should present scientific progress to the general public, as well as involve the public in research?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I've always been aware, for some reason, in the skepticism towards science. I read fiction a lot, and I have a lot of friends in the arts, and often they have an unusual way of looking at things, and it's very useful to listen. And I have quite a few friends who have very strong religious beliefs. And so it's very interesting to hear the opinions of people who think very differently to yourself, and who also doesn't have access to the same, exactly what you were saying, Mihai, to the same studies, and the same sources. And so they can come to a way of thinking that makes you realize, oh my gosh, we've a lot of work to do to shift this way of thinking. So I really appreciating that it's a very tough job, and that the very people who are rolled out, the professors, are often not the right people to do it. And this is precisely why we're trying to encourage the next generation of young researchers like yourselves, all you PhD students, to engage with this, so as to at least have a discussion more one-on-one, or no, more peer-to-peer, rather than the kind of the expert on high pronouncing about how it is. I mean, inevitably, yes, after those of us who've been years and years at it, our views hopefully are useful, but we are not necessarily the right people or the only people who should be delivering the message.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's totally true. And I hope also, because I had also other situations where other people asking me, and in that case, I tried to be way more soft with them and try to explain them, and I think it worked. So finally, it worked. But yeah, eventually it worked. But still, there are people, and I think the misinformation is playing a big role.
And also asking, so I think you made that point as well, just when you said the softly, asking them, what is it? Why? What is it that's stopping them? And then if you discover that it's misinformation, you can do something about that. But if you discover it's that they're frightened that the vaccine might do something, like I gather there's a big myth going around now that the vaccine is causing impotence in men. I mean, literally millions of men have received the vaccine, and impotence is not a side effect. But when many millions of men get anything, in amongst those are going to be men who suffer impotence anyway. Do you know what I mean? That there's, for whatever reason, unfortunately, seemingly a very high, shockingly high, I don't know how many it is, something like 30% of men will experience impotence in their lifetime. Okay, so in other words, that's actually quite a common event. And if it happens in some of the people who got vaccinated, it's not necessarily that the vaccine caused it. And so that's a really, really important, when John Hiska talks about education, this is a really important lesson that we should, or not lesson, thing that we should be looking at is about risk and correlation. Those two concepts are really quite difficult to communicate.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the difference between them. Okay. Oh yes, sorry, we're 1 minute over. Apologies.
We are going to introduce actually the two speakers.
Okay. Does Luke want to say goodbye on that one, or will we just go straight into the next?
Yeah, we can. For any question, like people just can put in the chat, and then we can go through later on. But yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mihai. So we're on to the second section, which is about what we have learned from the pandemic and what more do we need to know? Where is research going to go? And we're very privileged to have with us Kingston Mills, who's director of TBSI and professor of experimental immunology at Trinity, and who's been working for literally decades on immunology, and has a particular interest in vaccines, and is regularly in the Irish media talking about what's been happening. And we have Luke O'Neill, one of our most famous scientists. He's professor of biochemistry, but he is actually an immunologist, even though he does try to avoid that distinction, and is a wonderful communicator and an author extraordinaire. So welcome to you both. And can I say to our audience as well, please, as you're listening, please do type in comments and thoughts and questions. As you can see, we don't get around to them all, but we'll try and do that. So can I kick off by asking, getting you both to comment on what the big breakthroughs, that scientific research breakthroughs. So first of all, Kingston, during the pandemic, what have you seen as a major breakthrough?
Undoubtedly, the breakthrough during the pandemic is the speed at which vaccines can be made. In the past, it took 10 to 15 years from conception to get a vaccine onto the market. COVID-19 vaccines, successful COVID-19 vaccines, were brought onto the market within a year, which is absolutely extraordinary. Not only that, there were several COVID-19 vaccines, and more importantly, new platforms that had never been used before for vaccination, the messenger RNA vaccines, the adenovirus vector vaccines. These are new vaccines that work extraordinarily well, were brought onto the market in about 9 months. It took 6 weeks from the time the sequence was available of the virus genome to get for Pfizer and Moderna to start working on the vaccine. And it took them another couple of months to get into clinical trials, and then about 6 months to get approval and start using it. And of course, the success story is that in countries where vaccines are used, the incidence of disease is now almost confined to the unvaccinated and the younger population under 12 that are not vaccinated. So the vaccines have worked. And incredible data that came out of Israel this week, which estimated Israel has a population of 9 million, which is roughly twice that of Ireland. And they estimated the number of cases that were averted through vaccination, and it was 158,000. The number of hospitalizations averted was 25,000, and the number of deaths averted was 5,500 through vaccination. And Israel's vaccine success hasn't been actually that great because the uptake hasn't been as good as it is in Ireland. So in Ireland, I actually reckon if you extrapolate those data, they're going to even be better. So it's been absolutely extraordinary, the vaccine breakthroughs in the last year.
Okay. So, Luke, I presume you're going to say that's one. And if you are going to say that, then would you like to comment on why this has been such a massive
Yeah, I mean,
success?
it's obviously me and Kingston are always on the same page on these things, but it's fantastic science, remember. I mean, and it began in academia. So the technology in the vaccines often came from universities, and like Penn is a good example with this woman, Carico. She modified the RNA to make it less reactogenic, and that was a very important part of the story. You know, the liposome was invented in the University of British Columbia. Some of the technology came from there, you know. And then, of course, we have with the Oxford vaccine, that was a totally academic effort, and then they hooked up with AstraZeneca. So in other words, you've got a great story here of universities doing fundamental basic immunology research, right? And then that becomes really relevant with COVID, isn't it tremendous? And the notion they were done quickly, there was probably a decade of effort before this in many ways. And the whole RNA approach had been kicking around for quite a while. It was proposed for flu vaccines, as Kingston would know. You know, so in other words, it wasn't suddenly overnight, but it did take a rapid deployment of that knowledge. So I think it's a really good example of universities interacting with industry. I think it's the biggest health emergency in 100 years has been solved by a collective effort among academics and people in industry. It's a great example of this response. And of course, the response was needed because of the emergency we all found ourselves in. So it's incredible. I mean, I don't know what Kingston thinks. I was amazed how quick, by November, the Pfizer trial was reported. I was waiting, I'd say maybe 6 months later, maybe, you know?
I think, Luke, it was a combination of the factors that you just mentioned, of the 10 years of work. I mean, Moderna had been working away and BioNTech on this for 10 years, and they were pretty close to having vaccines that were approved, but you know, they picked a few areas that were quite tricky, a few diseases, and then it just clicked for the SARS-CoV virus 2 and worked. But it really was that, you know, if it hadn't been for the 10 years that preceded that, there's no way we would have had the vaccine so quickly. And the other thing that happened was, of course, a lot of money was thrown at it, in particular by the US. So the NIH gave billions, literally, to the pharma industry as well as to academia. And, you know, so the pharma industry really was put up to them to get on with it, and they did. And the other thing that happened was that the regulatory agencies approved the vaccines, albeit with emergency approval, much quicker than they normally would. And I'm not saying they took shortcuts, but they expedited the approval. Yeah. And that was a big game changer in terms of getting the thing, because everybody saw that the only way to solve this problem was vaccines. And so the collective effort worked.
Right. Can I come back to this business about the money? The fact that the NIH gave billions, literally, didn't they? No, we did it add up to billions, but anyways, hundreds of millions.
Billions, so not just billions, Cliona.
Yeah. So what do you think about this? Is one of the things I know that rattles the public, is the idea that public money was funneled into private enterprise. And this, I'm going at the very end, I'm going to come back to the TRIPS waiver and about the patent technology giving it out. So I'd like you both. Let's start with you, Luke, if you'd like to comment on that.
It's a complicated area, Cliona. The fact is, the vaccines are free, remember.
Yes.
So, you know, they provided these vaccines for free. Nobody in Ireland paid for a vaccine, or in Europe, you know. Now,
but it was free to the individual, but it's not free to the country.
Yeah, but that's the point, in a sense. But mind you could say our taxes were paying for this, because if governments subsidize the companies anyway, that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
But remember, those companies had to put up lots of effort. It's expensive enough to mobilize all those researchers, all those clinical trials. Some of that money recirculates back into the economy. It's not as if suddenly these drug companies got wealthy because of this,
right?
Because that money would have been spent on the ground, you know. Now, the next thing then is that of course, we would talk about their share price and future profits and all the rest of it. That's when it does get a bit murky, it must be said.
Yes, yes.
But the truth is, pharmaceutical companies are a business, and I mean, remember, I heard this today, or in Germany actually. You know, half of all the pension funds are invested in pharmaceutical companies.
I didn't know that.
So yeah. So in other words, you wouldn't be getting not you personally, Cliona, but lots wouldn't be getting pensions if pharma companies weren't making money as a business. It's a very complex ecosystem. This now it is.
Yes.
I know there's controversies, of course there are, and I appreciate that. And there can be examples of drug companies profiteering and all those kinds of things. We don't know what's going to happen in the next year or two with that question, you see. But I'm sure it'll be monitored closely. So it's not a very simple question to say, look, drug companies are going to make billions out of this. It's not as simple as that.
I think that's go on, Kingston.
Sorry, Cliona. I mean, one thing just to bear in mind: the average cost of bringing a drug to the market in the large pharma is $5 billion. So you know, and there's huge numbers of failures. along the way. So companies have to make profit to put it back into the company to develop the next generation of drugs. Now, I'm not a spokesperson for behalf of the pharma industry, far from it. And in fact, Pfizer's shares have done very well, and Moderna, which was a pretty small biotech company, is now one of the biggest in the world as a direct result of the success of the vaccine. And the other thing is that, just to be a bit cynical, Pfizer was promoting very strongly the idea of boosters for everybody in the US. And in the last 2 days, the FDA have said no, that we're going to boost only the over 65s, which I think is actually a credible decision by the FDA. I don't think healthy young people need boosters at this stage. I think that people who've got mRNA vaccines in particular are still probably pretty well protected. But Pfizer was doing that as a marketing trick, I think. I mean, I'm not accusing them of anything underhand, but certainly they weren't doing themselves a disservice by saying we need boosters. And they were giving the data from Israel. And the data from Israel actually looked very good when they boosted people that had had 2 doses. The antibody responses went up tenfold. So there was a very strong argument for boosters. And they will come. But I actually think the main boosters should wait until they have the Delta version of the vaccines available, which will probably later this year, early next year.
Okay, thanks. Can we just for a bit move off the vaccines a little bit, and can we come back to the research? And I was asking what you thought was the reason for the fabulous success with the vaccines. Can we talk about research in Ireland during COVID? Would you like to comment on whether Ireland was able to contribute in any significant way? Which of you would like to start with that?
I'll take that, Clean, if I may, because I was directing with Aileen Long the big initiative in Trinity, and we made a play very early on to Science Foundation Ireland, and of course, Clean, you helped very much in terms of brokering that, and to get funding to get going as quickly as we could, and we got. SFI gave us 3.75 million, and we were lucky enough to match that with donations from industry, including 2.4 million from Allied Irish banks. So that gave us 7 million to start a program of research in COVID-19 in Ireland. And probably, if you look at the successes from that program, probably one of the biggest successes is the rapid testing that Orla Shields and the other group in TTMI in Trinity Translation Medicine Institute have developed. And the other sort of successes are coming along. Luke's lab, if I may blow his own trumpet for him, has some fantastic data on potentially new anti-inflammatory therapies, and he can talk about that himself. And we have in my lab a new approach to vaccines. I know the vaccines sound like they've worked, and they have to a certain extent, but one of the things they don't do is they don't completely prevent infection in the nose and the nasal cavity with the infection. That allows transmission. And what we're working on, my group, is a vaccine that prevents nasal infection. And we had some data from the collaborators in the States there recently in a model which shows that they work really well. And the thing about this vaccine is given into the nose rather than injecting. So it induces local immunity. So those are 3 little nuggets of success that program of research has generated. And there's a lot of other stuff going on as well.
The clinicians, you could quite reasonably say that the clinicians did quite a bit with their paper, the long COVID and the fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a huge amount going on in St. James's on this, and people like Colin Berrigan and Niall Conlon and Clean Kelly and Townsend. So lots of papers coming out on the difference between people who progress and don't progress to inflammatory sense. So one of the things about COVID is that some people progress to very severe inflammation, not just in the lung, but outside the lung. And it's not quite understood why those progress. And others, clear the infection very quickly. And it seems to be down to the type of immune response you have inherently, either your innate response or the one that you acquire during the infection. And that's still not fully understood. And that's some of the things that's going on with the clinicians in James's.
And Luke might develop that because
Yes.
I
was very proud that I was just coming back from Germany, as you know, I was at a big immunology conference in Munich, and I could stand up and give my talk as I usually do, and I could say, I'm going to show you some COVID data now from our COVID network in Trinity. It's real to say it, And then we could show clinical samples from James's, where we saw caspase 4, which we're working on, is elevated in those Irish samples. I think it's an example of Irish labs stepping up to it. I mean, many of us were working in these areas. Now, I wasn't working on the vaccines. I'm working on anti-inflammatories, as Kingston says. But I could easily redeploy 3 projects to now look at anti-inflammatories in COVID. And we've made a bit of a breakthrough, it turns out. We've got a new way to stop the coagulation that's happening, potentially. And it's very early, But it was a great example of redirecting our research a bit into this big emergency. And I would also say, and it's a very important point, COVID will be a disease that will recede a bit. It'll still be here. One of the lines I'm using at the moment when I talk in public is, it will be in the medical textbooks in the infectious diseases chapter as a preventable disease with vaccines, and a disease that can be treated. That's like, if you do that chapter, you'll read about malaria, TB, and COVID-19 will be in there. So in other words, we're going to get to a point where it's preventable and treatable. And not in every case, but still it'll be huge progress. And we will use the knowledge we've learned from COVID in other diseases. That's very important to say.
So that brings us actually...
I mean, you're going to see new vaccines coming out of this and other diseases, potentially using the RNA technology, for instance. From my side, we could have new ways to stop immunothrombosis, which is a very important emerging area, or maybe even other respiratory diseases of the lung, because if we can suppress inflammation in lungs in COVID, why not try that medicine in some other disease? So I'm very optimistic in terms of other spin-outs. It's a bit like the moonshot gave rise to Teflon or whatever it was. So there will be spin-outs from this into other immune-mediated diseases that could be very useful.
But also there's a very useful comment here from the audience. Could we comment on, or could you guys comment on, what are the preparedness we've taken so far to avoid the next pandemic? So what do you think are the big lessons, or what should we be doing with the information that we have?
One of the things, Clean, if I could jump in there, that was sort of weak to start with was the testing. We were slow, not only in Ireland, every country was slow. Some countries, like, believe it or not, China and Tanzania were 2 examples of countries that did really well, and South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. And the reason, and Tanzania, interestingly, and Tanzania, because they had a history of infectious disease that they need to curtail. And they were very on the ball. In fact, the numbers of cases there has always been very low. And it was all down to do it with not just testing, but also isolating people appropriately early on in the pandemic. See, Ireland and a lot of countries were in denial. When we heard there were cases in Southeast Asia, we said, oh, that's a problem for Asia. It won't affect us. And then there were the cases in Italy, and we were still in denial. We were saying, oh, that's Northern Italy. It's not going to come to Ireland. Of course, 5,000 Italians came over to a rugby match here in Dublin, and the match was cancelled, but the Italians still came. And within days, of course, it took off in Ireland. So there was a lot of denial amongst, and it's natural. I mean, they say this is not going to affect us, but it did, of course. And we weren't really prepared for it. We weren't prepared in terms of how to deal with it and how to we didn't need lockdowns, but we need to be testing people and isolating those people early on. But it took the authorities here a long time to recognize that was essential. And that was the mistakes that were made early on. And I can't blame them. I mean, they've never had to deal with anything like this before. But the writing was on the wall from what happened in China and then what happened in Italy.
But
and we should have been more prepared.
Kingston, moving forward into the future, how do you think?
Sorry, I got diverted to going into the past. Yeah. So what we need to be doing in the future, we need to have a center of infectious diseases that's ready to diagnose and test for any new pathogen that's arising. And a lot of these pathogens come from non-human hosts. And SARS has been a good example. And flu, it moves from species, from animal species, from pigs and horses and birds into humans. This happens all the time, and it's a major concern around new viruses and bacteria in humans moving from species. So we need to be looking for this and be ready for it before it actually happens, and testing for it. So having systems in place that we can set up rapid testing. And then, of course, setting up the vaccine development. And obviously, the vaccine development will require pharma industry, but the companies need assistance from people like us. And that's how the current ones were developed. So we need to be ready with the system. The mRNA platform is been absolutely tremendous. And the applications of that platform to other infectious diseases are already happening. Not only to infectious disease, it's happening with cancer, it's happening with a myriad of medical conditions where getting protein into cells through messenger RNA is going to change, revolutionize medicine. And that's all down to the mRNA vaccines and COVID.
Okay, so look, you might develop a Kingston's thought, and especially because Brian Connor here in the chat is asking, what implications do we think the speed of the vaccine innovation and release to market has for future private-public partnerships in the sciences?
That's a very technical question, isn't it? But I mean, I think, I think what's going to, I mean, I'm sure Kingston would have a view on this as well. There's no doubt this RNA technology is working fantastically well. And it is owned by certain companies. So now the question now becomes, what diseases will they go after next? And BioNTech were actually going after cancer before COVID, you see. So there will be public-private partnerships with academic labs, I bet you. Like, for example, if there is a mucosal vaccine against disease X, of course they'll collaborate with someone like Kingston because he has the expertise, you see. So if anything, it will enhance academic industry research, you know, potentially in that way, because they still need academic researchers who are experts in certain areas. So I've no doubt that will continue, you see. So that's one thing I would say to that. But this one about what we've learned, in this meeting in Munich, there was a guy there from China. He was a delegate, he was a speaker, very eminent inflammasome guy, right? Now he works in Singapore, but he was telling us he'd been in Wuhan a week before the lockdown. And he got out of China back to Singapore. And the big question is, where did it come from, you see? And they still don't know. That's still the unanswered question. Was it a lab leak or was it natural? Now, we need to know that, because if it's a lab leak, it's less of a worry because it may not happen again, you'd hope. If this was a wild infection in a cave from bat guano or whatever it is, that could happen again. And there could be new coronaviruses jumping into humans. The big discussion we had yesterday over in the bar inevitably was, it must have been someone who was heavily immunosuppressed who probably got infected and they became a super spreader. The virus grew in them. And a number of things would have had to happen for that single person to be the super spreader, and they may have gone to a big concert or something, you know, and next thing they're spewing virus everywhere, and now 2 people out of 1,000 get infected, and maybe they were immunosuppressed, and then it grows in their bodies, and now it begins to happen, you know. So those are questions that we don't know the answer to, and a lot of effort will go into now, I think, trying to answer the question of where it came from. Now, if it happens again, and there's a chance it will, of course, and other coronavirus, bats have lots of coronaviruses in them. So why wouldn't it happen again? You'd hope that we can press the button on this and react much more quickly, having learned from the first time round. Yeah. And the things like testing is essential because, and remember, for months we were all saying this, get the testing right. Remember? Remember Paul Moyna, our dear former colleague, had a great suggestion to do pool samples in neighborhoods, you know? Exactly. That kind of idea. He was saying that in April of 2020. Last year. Yeah. So why we didn't get a better response? Now, I'm not, again, as King said, it was a new situation and so on. But by God, we should have testing right and very quickly.
And we still don't have it right. And we still don't have it right, Luke. There's a question there about rapid antigen testing, and the resistance to it in Ireland has been hard to fathom. I mean, it's unbelievable because, you know, the thing about rapid testing, these lateral flow tests or the LAMP test that we use in Trinity, is that they can pick up people when they're in the infectious stage of the infection. In other words, when they can transmit it. And that's really when you want to catch people. And the PCR test is the gold standard diagnostic test, but it's extremely sensitive. And it picks up virus in people who are not transmitting. So it's actually, you know, it's oversensitive in terms of the numbers of cases that it deems to be there. So rapid testing is something that, frustratingly, the authorities here haven't really appreciated the benefits of. And I think as we go forward, and there will be, and there are vaccine breakthrough cases, so people are fully vaccinated getting infected, we've got to catch these people, and the way to catch them is to rapid test everybody, not everybody every day in their home, but going to work or going to school or going to college.
And so in fairness, this is something that's going on in St. James's, the healthcare workers. There's a very nice test where they're doing or a very nice study where they're doing 2 antigen tests per week. There are 300 volunteers looking for breakthrough infections. And that reminds me of these really nice studies that the HSE sponsored on antibody or surveillance to look at incidence rates in St. James's. But I would like to kind of broaden out the discussion out of Ireland in a way now for the last few minutes, and to ask you what you think about, again, back to this preparedness, dealing with the future. I mean, we have a small number of companies that are in control of the vaccines at the moment and of the technologies. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on getting the technologies out to other countries so that they can develop their own vaccines? Is this something we should be doing? So, but specifically, the TRIPS waiver, what are your thoughts on that? So I'll start with Kingston, okay?
I think that it's already happening in that AstraZeneca has a deal with the Serum Institute of India, where their vaccine is being made in India for the Indian and the developing world market. So that's actually happening. But I think what has to happen now is that the other platforms, the mRNA platforms, which are a bit more effective than the AstraZeneca, needs to start to be made in developing countries. I mean, giving them is one way of approaching it, but I actually think it's better if you get the countries to make it for themselves. There are lots of countries. India has 2 pharmaceutical companies, the Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech, who can literally make billions of doses of vaccines. So they're capable of doing it. So they just need to be financed to do it. So,
but what about very large African countries like Nigeria? How do we get the technologies there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the South Africa certainly has the infrastructure to make vaccines. And I don't know about Nigeria whether they have or not, but I think there are other countries that could make it for Nigeria. I mean, the amazing thing is that, in fact, apart from South Africa and a few other countries, COVID hasn't been a huge problem in Africa, which has been difficult to understand. I mean, it isn't clean. The numbers are still very small apart from South Africa and Nigeria and 1 or 2 others. A lot of other countries.
The Economist would disagree. The Economist had a model only last week. It was modelling deaths across the world and was saying that they by their estimation that the death rates are significantly underestimated because they're not.
Oh, absolutely, that's for sure, Cliona. Absolutely, I agree completely. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't vaccinate the whole of Africa. Exactly. So don't get me wrong. I'm saying the official figures on deaths in Africa has been much lower than would have been predicted, but the official figures probably completely underestimate. Sorry, I've hogged it, Luke.
Yeah. What do you think about this?
Africa is so important. I am plugged into the African immunology community, strangely, because the current president of the International Union of Immunology Societies is a South African immunologist, remember. And there's a big conference going to happen. And the plan was to have a conference in Cape Town in 2022, right? And they asked me to visit Malawi and Tanzania to encourage local immunologists to attend the conference. Because as the 3 of us know, it's very sparse there. It's very underdeveloped. There aren't that many labs, and very well-meaning. Malawi is a good example. I spoke at a conference in Malawi by Zoom about a month ago. So what's happening is Africa's getting better in terms of immunology all the time. They're trying to promote it in various ways, encourage it, and that's why the IUIS, I think, picked Cape Town as its place to have their conference. Now, I also think that it is possible to build a factory in Nigeria to make these RNA vaccines. That's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Yeah.
These are actually quite straightforward. They're much more straightforward than the adenoviral vector ones, for instance. They're certainly more straightforward than a live attenuated vaccine. It's a chemical thing. You make the RNA, you stick it in a liposome, and that's your vaccine. It's literally chemically based. So it's not beyond the wit of the world to build a massive plant in a couple of African countries to make these vaccines and then make future ones as well. And what they need to do, in a sense, is do what India did and have 2 massive companies that make vaccines for Africa. It's so important. And they are discussing this. This is all in hand, by the way. And the likes of COVAX, I mean, they know donating vaccines isn't the way to do it because it takes forever and it's painful and nobody wants to do it half the time and all the rest of it. And the dialogue over boosters and young people and who will we give the vaccine to? Make the vaccine there. That's the obvious answer. Because it does take a while. You can't build these factories and open them in a week. And the regulatory aspects are intense for obvious reasons, like the FDA, EMA, or whatever, have to sign off on these factories, of course, so it's not trivial, but it's not beyond the wit of the capacities to build these factories to make the vaccines as locally as you can is the answer, really.
And inevitably there'll be training opportunities or the training requirements. I think that's something that Ireland could help, to try and get that expertise. We're saying that we're short on expertise in this country. That would be the same there. Okay, so we've come to I know there's loads more we could talk about, and there's all sorts of questions here. Will we try to deal very specific? It is known how long immunity lasts for those who have received 2 doses and are immunosuppressed? Yeah, this is a difficult question because people measure antibodies, and if you haven't been infected, the antibodies go down inevitably. But what's happening to your T cells and your memory cells, we really don't know. But Kingston, you might like to just
I mean, there's lots of studies coming out now about the some waning of immunity, and for sure, people that are immune suppressed, the immunity is going to wane because they started off at a lower level. And the other thing is the adenovirus vector vaccines, immunity waning is greater because again they start at a lower level to start with, probably tenfold lower than the mRNA vaccines. So for the mRNA vaccines, the waning immunity is not a big issue for an adult that's healthy at this stage. But sometime next year they will need to be boosted. For people who are older or people who got the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson just came out this week and published data on a booster, a 2-dose vaccine. Schedule, and it was fantastic, a booster response to the second dose. So that just talks to the need for boosters for the Johnson & Johnson and for the AstraZeneca.
And for more,
there's talk of them becoming 3-shot vaccines anyway. That's in the future.
Yes.
Like the Hep B vaccines, 3-shot, for instance, and that makes sense. And the Israeli data was amazing. I mean,
exactly.
The third shot in Israel, they got a 10-fold higher antibody level than after the second shot with the third shot. So we can predict this anyway from first principles. You can predict these things, and you could get 1, 2, 3 years protection with the third shot. You see, that's a reasonable prospect here, really.
I suppose the big question, though, Luke, is whether you wait until you get the Delta version of the vaccine to do the boosting, because it seems logical to do that for most people, and I think they'll probably be ready by the end of the year. So that would be, But in the meantime, I think I would be very positive about the vaccines, between now and the end of this year, and that we don't need to be boosting everybody. And I think the FDA, that's what they decided during the week, but they said no, not for under 65s if they're healthy.
Good. So on that positive note, I'll thank you both. Yeah, you've got a sunny opinion for what's happening now, and also for the future and for the globe. But we've still an awful lot of work to do. So all those researchers, keep at it, and anybody out there interested in science and immunology, find out more and come and ask us more. Come and hear more of the research that we're doing. So thank you very much. Yeah, Luke, and thank you very much, Kingston. And
thanks, guys.
See you guys.
Thanks, Dina.
Pass you over. There's Clina.
Good evening, everybody. Well, I would like to thank, good evening, Clina and Colin. I would like to first thank all the speakers for these amazing talks we've had so far. Very interesting. And we are going to start with the last section of our event tonight, which will revolve around long COVID or chronic COVID. And today we have Clina Nikalenki and Colin Doherty joining us to give us some insights into what actually this pathology is and how we can deal with it. And a small introduction about our speakers tonight. So Colin is a consultant neurologist, and he's the director of the epilepsy service at St. James in Dublin. And his expertise ranges from epilepsy to dementia, and including also traumatic brain injury. But lately, he's also been doing some amazing work on persistent symptoms around long COVID and how they are linked to the blood-brain barrier. And on the other side, we also have Clina, and she's an associate professor consultant at Trinity College in Dublin, and which I thought was very interesting. She's also the clinical lead at the Inclusion Health Service at St. James, which advocates for medical and psychological needs and health inequality among the excluded populations such as homeless people and refugees and prisoners. So today we will be talking about what is long COVID, what actually this pathology is, and the great risk that it poses even after this long pandemic that we've had. And actually, there's a lot of different manifestations for this pathology. There's many different clinical signs, and there's still a lot to be researched and understood about this pathology. So first, I would like to give the word to Clina and Colin to give us a little bit of insights on what the actual clinical manifestations are and what the possible causes of this pathology are. So Clina, Colin?
So
Yes.
Colin knows much more than I do about long COVID, so I'll start, and then he can fill in all the extra
details.
bits. But I suppose we see long COVID in patients, but we also see it a lot in our colleagues. So a lot of COVID, particularly in the first wave, it was very much occupational health. A lot of healthcare workers got infected. So we see the spectrum of disease in our colleagues, and some people get COVID, recover, feel fine, go back to normal, and some people don't. And some of the people who don't are people who've been in intensive care for long periods of time on a ventilator, and that may be a different pathology. So we know that people who are in intensive care, ventilated, sedated for a long period of time, they have lots of side effects just of that. So I'd almost, and I think Colin would agree, that's almost a separate pathology to what we're looking at. But what's more commonly known as long COVID, it's all these different symptoms that people get. They can be quite fluctuant, so they can change from time to time. A lot of them are around people's memory, people's concentration, and their exercise tolerance. And they can be quite disabling. So I think, we all have colleagues who still aren't back at work who got sick in the spring. So I'll hand over to Colin now for a more thorough explanation.
Thank you, Clina. Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing to say is I think we need to be extremely scientifically humble in front of this condition. We're really very early in understanding it. It was interesting that you called it a pathology. I've heard that term used about 8 times between the two of you there, and I'm thinking, is it a pathology? Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it is a pathology. I don't know what the pathology is, though. I think it's worth talking about what the research community has decided are the definitions of long COVID, so that, for a clinical research point of view, that we at least all agree. So the first thing to say is that any symptoms lasting longer than 4 weeks is considered to be a long COVID syndrome. And there does seem to be, at least again from a research perspective, some value in distinguishing between the 4 to 12 weeks and then post 12 weeks. They seem to be slightly different. So a lot of patients who've been unwell from acute COVID, their symptoms often persist beyond the 4-week marker. But the people who have symptoms more than 12 weeks, lots of them go on. And in fact, 40% of them will say that they will say that their symptoms have lasted more than a year. So this is a really quite an unusual group. Now, the first thing to say is that this is a worldwide pandemic and the numbers are very large, but we do have post-viral fatigue syndromes well described going back in history. The idea that you would be fatigued and washed out after a viral infection is very, very long-standing. And some patients get very, very long-standing fatigue. And of course, there is the condition called chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalitis, which is a very enigmatic disorder that no one really understands. And in fact, one of the great things that might come from this syndrome is the more understanding of exactly what chronic fatigue syndrome is. So yeah, there's no point in trying to list the symptoms. Every system is involved, right?
Yes.
But I think there's kind of fairly good, this sounds a very self-serving comment now coming from a neurologist, but there's probably reasonably good evidence to say that this is now a sort of neuropsychiatric disease. It's turned from an acutely respiratory disease, this is where the word SARS came from, severe respiratory disease, to one that's primarily now neuropsychiatric. So it's fatigue, it's muscle pain, headaches, brain fog. Yes, there are people who still have breathing difficulties, and there are those who've suffered cardiac damage who have problems. But I think that and this is a very important point, the neurology now that exists in the long COVID population is in stark difference to the neurology initially. I was really fascinated by how little acute neurology there was with this disease. I thought we were going to see encephalitis all over the place. I mean, this virus is it's an animal virus, essentially. It's a beta coronavirus. And we have animal models of these. The mouse hepatitis virus is very similar. That causes encephalitis in the mouse brain. We use it as a model for MS. So I'm thinking this is going to be it. We're going to be overwhelmed with encephalitis, and of course, it never happened.
Yeah.
We had lots of people complaining of difficulty smelling, anosmia. You get that as well with the flu. You get that with a lot of respiratory viruses. Maybe not as much, but that was the really main neurological phenomenon early on. And now it's completely switched. And now we have essentially a disorder which really affects the neurological system. It affects the psychological system. And yes, you're right. It's scary because the public health system is not ready for this. And we don't have enough people. We don't have enough therapists. And we have to really, we need to cooperate as a community across, like the immunologists are doing, like the vaccine developers are doing. We need to cooperate across countries to understand it better.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I was discussing this with Klina the other day, because it seems like the patients are playing a very important role in the actual understanding of this long COVID and how they describe the symptoms. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of stigma to it, because these neurological signs, such as depression and anxiety, are not something very well defined, and some people don't feel comfortable talking about this. So what do you think about the involvement of the patients in defining and helping us understand this
I
pathology?
think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And there's a really good paper that I recommend that I think I sent on to you, Sonia, describing the role of the patient in defining long COVID. So it's long COVID, the illness narratives, it's called. And if anybody wants to have a look, it's a really good paper. And it's fascinating kind of from a sociological point of view, because there were all these people who got through acute COVID. As Colin was saying, we were all focused on the lung disease, the hypoxia, getting people through that acute illness. And then people were by themselves, the GPs weren't seeing patients face to face. So they all kind of linked up through the internet and really defined the illness themselves. And a lot of them were healthcare workers because of so many of healthcare workers getting the disease. So it's really interesting, I think, from a sociological point of view. And as Colin was saying, neurological diseases or neuropsychological diseases, they don't fit the traditional disease narrative where you get sick, you take a tablet and you get better, and it can affect people's sense of self and their function in society much more. So I think that poses an additional challenge to when we're trying to address it. And again, it's something that I think neurologists probably have a lot of expertise in.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I would just add the involvement of the patient descriptor. I mean, it is very interesting, and it seems like a new thing. But I mean, Klina will know that there has been a strong movement of involving patients, not just in helping define their disease, but also in designing the services for them. That's been a growing movement. It's really come to the fore with this. But the idea of what we call co-design, that's pretty prominent now in new modern healthcare, and it's generally a good movement. And I hope that we can liaise with the patient groups who are suffering from long COVID here in doing research.
Yeah, and I think I'm lucky. I part of my work is in people with people who have HIV, and the medication in that works so well. And that's a really patient-driven story. It was very much to do with people with HIV getting together, defining the illness, advocating for research, advocating for treatments, and a lot of stigma as well. So,
back in the
I think something similar may be needed in long COVID.
Yeah, indeed. And one thing that is striking to me is like, do we actually know where the symptoms are coming from? Because there is a lot of theories out there, right? Some theories say that it's a constant state of inflammation causing these long-term symptoms. Some places, some articles place these symptoms on strokes due to the coagulation problems and damaging in certain parts of the brain. So what do we actually know about the causes of COVID? If you'd like to start, Colin.
Okay, I'll take that first. I think the first thing to say is that, again, I'm going to invoke the humility I addressed earlier on. We don't really know, and I can explain a little bit of the research that we've done. There are some common mechanisms, it seems. I think the first thing to say is there does not appear to be, certainly nothing that I've read that suggests direct invasion of the brain by the virus. That does not seem to happen. So that's very important because it means, of course, a whole range of therapies, antiviral therapies, are not going to work. Inflammatory markers are also kind of lacking. There isn't a lot of inflammation appearing in the brain tissue. I mean, inflammation, there's big cytokine storms occurring in the lungs, and the heart is getting myocarditis, but the brain isn't looking like it's inflamed. Now, what we found very early on, we were funded through the SFI program last summer to start. In fact, we started looking at anosmia. I mean, long COVID wasn't an issue, if you remember, last July. I mean, no one really knew about it. But we started looking at anosmia because we knew there were patients who had persistent anosmia, and we speculated because the blood-brain barrier in the olfactory bulb is actually more rudimentary than it is elsewhere in the body. And we thought maybe what's happening here is that there's inflammation or blood-brain barrier breakdown in the olfactory bulb, which is causing anosmia, and in certain people that it persists because the blood-brain barrier, dysfunction persists. Yeah. And in fact, we have good data to support that hypothesis. But what happened then was we started to see a lot of patients coming in with this anosmia, but they were also complaining of concentration difficulties, of depression, of brain fog. And when we did our technique looking at the human brain, looking at blood-brain barrier function, we saw widespread dysfunction of the blood-brain barrier. Now, that's a thing that I've been studying with Matthew Campbell from the Department of Genetics in Trinity for a number of years across a range of conditions. And it does seem that blood-brain barrier dysfunction is a sort of a common pathway for the brain under stress. Yeah. And vulnerable patients get this. Patients with psychiatric morbidity get brain dysfunction. My epilepsy patients have blood-brain barrier dysfunction, and when we stop their seizures, it recovers. Clina has very nice data showing that homeless patients, because of a range of things they're up against, have blood-brain barrier dysfunction. So all we can say now is we don't have viral infection of the brain, but we have very good evidence that the normal homeostatic mechanisms in the brain are breaking down and blood-brain barrier dysfunction. And remember, I'm talking about persistent. These patients have all had symptoms beyond 12 weeks. And some of the cases we're picking up now have had symptoms more than a year. And in every single one of them, we found this similar pattern of blood-brain barrier dysfunction. So I'll hand over to Clina because, her patients, she knows this very well because she's brought her experience of this vulnerable group of homeless patients as well who've shown this.
Yes. So what do you think, Clina? I mean, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, I'm on mute. I agree. So I think Colin and I had been talking about the blood-brain barrier in homeless people or people who are under stress, psychosocial stress for a long time. And it definitely does affect your ability to pay attention, to remember things, to make decisions, that kind of high-level function that people with long COVID describe. So there are some similarities certainly in how it's presenting, and I think it's a very plausible explanation. I did some work with Liam Townsend and Cliona O'Farrelly looking at type 1 interferon signaling because we thought that could be a cause, and we didn't see any evidence of that. So the work that Liam and I and colleagues have done, we've looked for various immunological dysfunctions that would correlate with long COVID, and we haven't seen that. So I think that Colin's idea of looking at the blood-brain barrier in detail is a really good one.
And with regards to this, actually, I would like to bring the conversation to the prevalence of long COVID, because you're talking about, for example, these homeless people having this impairment of the blood-brain barrier. Does this mean that there is a higher chance for these people to get long COVID? And also to bring one of the questions from the public, about prevalence as well of long COVID. Is it more prevalent as well, not only in these homeless people, but also in certain ages, like one of the questions from the public was posed?
So there's certainly data suggesting that so it's important when you're thinking about the prevalence of long COVID to be able to look at it in people who have had COVID, right? Because the risk of exposure to COVID varies between different populations. So you need to correct for that. But if you look at in terms of people who get COVID, how many of those are likely to get long COVID? It's more common in people from poorer areas. So it looks like there's the same socioeconomic gradient that we see with most other diseases. If you're poorer, you're more likely to get long COVID. And that would, again, potentially fit with the blood-brain barrier hypothesis or some other potential immune mechanisms. Women are much more likely to get long COVID than men. And that's interesting because there are a lot of differences between the immune response in men and women. I don't know if there's any data on blood-brain barrier differences between men and women? Colin, has anybody looked at it? I don't know.
Well, we've seen this in concussion. In our concussion patients, there's a different blood-brain barrier response in women. So I don't know what, I mean, there presumably is a possibly hormonal explanation for that. For instance, we know that migraine is another condition, very, very common, that affects blood-brain barrier function, and that's twice as common in women as it is in men. So I think that's what we're going to find. But you're right, and I think most interestingly though is vulnerable populations, socially deprived populations, are more vulnerable to long COVID than others, which is important, and that's going to again be an important public health factor going forward.
Yes.
Hope we get a chance to talk about how we fix it now.
Yes. And also, actually, regarding the gender differences, I also read that one of the theories is the inflammation state of a pregnancy theory about women getting more autoimmune diseases, but also, in this case, maybe can be more affected by this type of infectious diseases. I don't know if you know anything about this.
There's loads. There's at least 20 differences between men and women in terms of immune responses, some of which are because women have 2 X chromosomes. So some toll-like receptor genes are on the X chromosome, so you have more of those if you have 2 X's. Some of them are estrogen driven. So, for example, migraine is often associated with a menstrual cycle, so levels of female hormones, and those differences that are female hormone dependent often then in postmenopausal women revert back to normal. So there's so many, but I think again it's another good clue. And ME, I think, or chronic fatigue is more common in women, isn't it, Colin?
I don't know the answer to that, so I'm not going to.
I'll have a quick Google.
Yeah.
And actually, speaking of the fatigue as well, there was a question from the public, from Brendan Cooney. Why is post-viral fatigue, etc., so I'm guessing all this type of symptoms that we're talking about, not talked about more and this highlighted more to the general public? Is this symptomatic of a lack of communication and aloofness by the scientific community? Where is this coming from, basically, the lack of communication?
I think Colin will probably have, again, a lot of insight, because a lot of neurological disorders were initially thought to be, hysterical, and even now are maybe perceived in a different way. So part of the problem with post-viral fatigue is you don't look any different. You've no lumps, you've nothing that sounds different or looks different. And it's chronic, and we don't have a diagnostic test, and we don't have a treatment. So it's very frustrating as a clinician, because somebody comes into you and says they feel tired, and you check their thyroid and it's normal, and then really that's all you can do, and off they go. So I don't know, Colin, if you have more thoughts on that one.
Well, the only thing I would add to that is that there's a big legacy here of the failure of the medical community to come to terms with chronic fatigue syndromes that have evolved mostly after viral infections. So we haven't been able to help people. And, I think this is another good example of, it's not just that this research into this will help us with those patients. The fact that they're heavily involved with us and that we're not shouting at each other across, loud hailers across the room. We need to go on this journey together, and hopefully we will have something to say about chronic fatigue. I think the blood-brain barrier stuff is fascinating because, as Cliona said, the question of whether there's a psychological element to some of this, is always prevalent in people's minds. And given the way we think of mental health issues, they tend, on the scale of illnesses, tend to be lower down on the, for instance, I don't know if you would call, for instance, would you use the word pathology for someone with depression? I'm just asking you that question. Would you say
it's a very difficult one, but it's not a reason to disregard it. That's for sure.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Do we generally think of people with depression not having abnormalities visible on their brain, or no serological abnormalities? I mean, there are some research things, but there's nothing out there in the clinic. You can't do a blood test and say, oh yeah, look, you've got depression. So the blood-brain barrier, though, is fascinating, because what we're seeing is across the long COVID people, no matter what they're complaining of, if it's acute anxiety or depression or brain fog or failure to concentrate or headaches, the barrier dysfunction is common to them all. And that really gives us a really nice hook to say, it doesn't matter now. We don't have to give a hierarchy of the good symptoms versus the bad. We now have a symptom complex. We have a basic common pathway, which seems to be barrier dysfunction. And let's harness some of the 7 million that the researchers got into looking at, It's
Yeah,
very
of
hard to
course.
get research money for this kind of stuff. I can tell you, it's really hard. And maybe there's a bit of a legacy there of looking at kind of mental health issues, biologically, not enough research money going into them. But I think that's going to be the really exciting thing, is ways in which we can, manage barrier dysfunction. And there's going to be very obvious, like, for instance, if you give someone a dose of steroids, you will transiently fix the barrier very quickly.
Yeah.
Now it goes back if it's chronically broken, it'll go back to being. But you can imagine inhaled steroids, for instance, should be used possibly in patients with anosmia. I looked at trying to drive a clinical trial looking at inhaled steroids, and it was just too difficult. And I just don't have the resources or the money to get a trial like that going. But anosmia, like, is a really, really dangerous thing. I mean, smell
And
is
for the
most,
public, anosmia is the loss of smell, in case
sorry,
they are not,
loss of smell.
they're
Loss
not
of smell
aware.
is
Yeah.
probably, people given a choice between loss of smell or going deaf or going blind, people will take
Yes.
loss of smell every time. Can you imagine? If this condition caused 40% of our patients to go blind?
Yeah.
I mean, the world would end.
No, for
And yet,
sure.
here's a major sense, smell, which is lost, and it's dangerous. People can't smell the gas leak, and they can't smell, you know what I mean? And so, really, it's amazing to me that we haven't put the kind of funding in to study how to fix that.
And actually, apart from this research being really beneficial for other diseases, like you were mentioning, but about the loss of smell, and I'm gonna take the chance to bring in actually another topic and another question from the public that I wanted to bring in today. The scientist in the comments said that my friend, 22 years old, got COVID 1 year ago and lost his sense of smell for a year now. Although young people don't get severe illness from COVID, some are still suffering from its side effects. So what can we do about this? And I'm going to take the chance of using this question to bring in how are we going to deal with this long symptoms in these patients, and how are we going to deal with these patients? Because some of the symptoms include depression, anxiety, loss of smell, that could prevent you for having a normal functional life. So how do we deal with the treatment of these patients, and how do we keep track of how these patients are doing, and how do we reinsert them, as of to say, in society and in back to work? How do we deal with these patients?
Kleena, do you want to start or take a crack at that?
There's a whole lot in that one.
Yes.
And it's coming back to what do we think is severe and not, and what do we think is important and not. And as Colin said, smell is really important. And we know, say, for older people, when they lose their sense of smell, they don't eat, they get frail, they decline. So it has very important consequences. Eating and most of our taste is actually smell, is a really important pleasure in life for many people, for most people. So losing your sense of smell is not a minor thing, but it's maybe not as dramatic or as visible, or so it gets less valued. And I think, it's coming back to what Colin said about mental health, for example, hugely underfunded, hugely under-resourced in research and clinical service, treated differently. Somebody's depressed, you're like, well, would you just get out of it and, go up and go to work? And I think there's a bit of that in terms of long COVID. But if we don't address these issues as a society, we're going to have a massive chunk of society that aren't able to function properly. And that will have huge consequences for all of us. So I think it really is about broadening what we consider important and how we look at things, how we look at humans, really.
Yes. Colin, what are your thoughts?
I would add to that, just be more specifically about potential ways of treating, the blood-brain barrier dysfunction. So that's one question which we don't know the answer to. And again, bringing in, inoculating this conversation with some common sense. We don't know how many people we're going to still have in 2 years' time that will still have symptoms. I mean, the best guess is that we probably will have about between 5 and 7% of the recovered population who have, still have some symptoms at a year. There'll probably be less than that by 2 years, but in the long term, we're going to have a proportion. And my rough back of the envelope calculations are putting that number at about 5,000 to 7,000 patients. That's a massive number. Like, there's only 8,000 people in Ireland who have migraine, or males. Double that number with females. So 8,000, so that's a big number of people, and they're going to need a service. And there's a whole range of things that need to be put in place for them from the public health perspective, including support, mental health support, physio, occupational therapy, psychology, all that. Therapies, though, the great thing about Ireland is that we have the capacity, because of the, uniqueness of the in-reach of people like Cliona, who is, Cliona O'Farrelly and all the scientists in the immunology labs. And we have this in-reach. We can do this research here. We can really do this. And there are a number of therapies. So I'm going to give a shout out to Matt Campbell again. So Matt's this genius who works in genetics, and he looks at these proteins, particularly at looking at Claudin-5, which is this gap junction protein. And that is dysfunctional in blood-brain barrier dysfunction. And he's already looking at gene therapy that might fix the blood-brain barrier. And again, massive need for investment in that kind of research. But I would say, that the future is bright. And if we can take this kind of broad view of neuropsychiatric phenomena, maybe we don't call it a pathology, maybe because we can't see it under a microscope, but it's a dysfunction. And everyone who has this is suffering. And let's work with them and all the scientists and the clinicians to get together and fund it.
Yeah.
I'll take checks made out to our department.
No, indeed. There's clearly a lot of research to be done, and a clear need for collaboration between, the basic researchers and the clinicians and the patients as well. So yeah, with this, I would like, to thank you both for being here. It's a very interesting conversation. I wish we could keep talking for a little bit longer, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you, Colin, and thank you, Cliona. And I would like to thank all the speakers from tonight. I feel personally very privileged to have had this amazing panel tonight and these amazing conversations. And also, thank the audience, because they've been really active today and they've participated a lot, which is what we wanted to do with this event tonight, actually, because it's to bring the science to everybody, right? And also, finally, I would like to stress I'd like to stress the importance of the European funding into our consortium, but also many other consortiums like ours within Horizon 2020, because we're training young researchers like us, and we're bringing together different pharmaceutical companies and different universities and institutes to work into these problems, like we are doing with COVID-19 right now. So with this, I would like to close the event tonight, and thank you all for joining. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.